Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica Flutie, and I'm on the Skull Foundation team. And I am very excited to welcome you to this virtual Skull World Forum Week event, which we are convening with the Rockefeller Foundation and Connected Women Leaders. So thank you so much for taking your time this morning or this afternoon or evening to join us. As many of you know, the Skull Foundation is a private foundation based in Palo Alto, California. We support social entrepreneurs who are addressing the world's most pressing challenges with innovative solutions. And I hope some of you were able to watch the broadcast yesterday where we announced the 2020 Skull Awards for Social Entrepreneurship recipients for the year. It's an incredible group of social entrepreneurs, and I encourage you to check that out on skull.org. The Skull Foundation each year convenes the Skull World Forum, and usually that happens this week in Oxford, England. It brings together 1,200 leaders from across the social entrepreneurship and philanthropy and social impact landscape for a week of learning and connecting in person. Unfortunately, this year, due to the coronavirus, we were forced to cancel that physical event, but we have found a silver lining in convening this virtual week. The theme that we had selected months and months ago for the forum was collective strength. And so when faced with this cancellation, we thought there was no better way to sort of tap into that theme of collective strength than to invite our network of Skull Award winners and nonprofits and other funders and activists to contribute their own sessions to the Skull World Forum Week. And so we now have more than 100 organizations who have contributed 140 virtual events to the week. And this is the concluding day of the week, and we're thrilled to be able to end this week with such an amazing session today. So I just have a few matters of housekeeping to go through and help you understand how to use the platform that we are on. We are recording this conversation, and it will be published online shortly after the meeting is over. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please do submit any questions you have for your panelists throughout the next hour through the Q&A box. And of course, you're welcome to use the chat function as well on the right side of your screen to chat with each other. We just ask that any questions for our panelists you submit through that Q&A. So with that, again, thank you. Welcome to the Skull World Forum Virtual Week, and I will turn it over to our amazing board member, Pat Mitchell.
Thank you, Jessica, and congratulations on this inspiring week of the first virtual Skull Forum. Today's forum is convened in partnership with the Skull Foundation and the Connected Women Leaders Initiative, which was launched by the Rockefeller Foundation in 2017. Along with my co-founder, Rhonda Carnegie, we convene women leaders from government, civil society, business, social enterprises for the purpose of shared learning, problem solving, and mobilizing networks and communities. And many of our women leaders from more than 24 countries are joining us for today's forum, as well as many of Skull's social entrepreneur community who, as you know, are working every day on solving the world's most pressing problems and urgent threats. And today we focus on what has become the world's most urgent threat, the COVID-19 crisis. But we're going to do so from a different perspective. Our focus will be how we take the lessons from this pandemic and the responses of a global community and apply these learnings to the climate crisis. Because what has emerged already from COVID-19 is that the world feels more connected than ever, given technologies such as the one we're using today and the global threat of a virus. It feels fragile and perhaps forever changed as we face the uncertainty of the full consequences of this crisis. But what is also being observed and experienced is that we as a global community are capable of changing behavior to face this serious threat. We're doing it. Social distancing, self-quarantining, responding responsibly to protect ourselves and our fellow human beings. So will this be the time, perhaps, when we also consider the radical and transformative changes needed in behavior to meet a global crisis that has put the future of sustainable life on this planet at great risk? Now, there are many pathways to answer that question. But today our focus is going to be on solutions as viewed through a gender lens, the link between the education of girls, the health and well-being of women, especially women in the most vulnerable populations, and the elevation of women's voices in global negotiations and agreement, all essential to implementing just and sustainable solutions to the climate emergency. We have an opportunity today to learn more about the intersectionality of gender and climate from women and girls leading from many different perspectives, different generations, putting forward different but interconnected strategies, all leading us toward solutions to the climate crisis that are more just and sustainable. And first, I welcome a woman who was Ireland's first woman president, a woman who put the climate emergency on the world's agenda as the UN's climate envoy and ambassador for human rights, a woman who has pulled together a coalition of women leaders in Paris to ensure that we had negotiated an agreement, a global agreement, which was signed by 197 countries in 2019. A woman that I now fondly refer to as the mother of climate justice. She wrote a book, by the way, by that name, and she hosts a podcast called Mothers of Invention, which celebrates the many women who are shaping these intersectional solutions to ensure climate justice. Mary Robinson, welcome. And first, let's define for everyone what you mean by climate justice. And then please share with us what you've observed now as the impact of a global health emergency on an already existing emergency of what we have done to the planet.
Thank you, Pat. It's wonderful to be on this panel, and thank you to everybody concerned in making this possible. Let me go back to last January. I was so worried. I joined with millions of children and young people worldwide, Fridays for Future, saying, why are we not taking climate more seriously? And in particular, I had a climate justice perspective, which means more concerned about people and a strong gender dimension and a very strong dimension of thinking about more vulnerable people, small island states, poorer countries, indigenous communities, poorer communities in richer countries, and the fact that women were in the front line. And I was so worried because we were not taking action. And 2020 was the year when we were supposed to take a lot of action, do very ambitious, nationally determined contributions. But there was no sign of the kind of leadership that we were going to need. And, in March, on the 10th of March, the UN Secretary General said we were way off track in meeting our climate commitments. So that was a crisis of great gravity that we were not taking seriously enough. And then somehow on top of that, we have the sudden, dramatic, earth-shaking COVID-19, which has turned our whole world upside down, which is devastating lives, health, livelihoods, economies. We're in a global recession. It's a pandemic. Suddenly, we're facing a terrible reality, and people have responded incredibly. They have responded by changing their behavior, by suddenly being prepared to social distance, to stay in their homes, to practice what will be good for the health of others. People are thinking of the elderly in their community, the more vulnerable in their community, the health workers who are on the front lines, that they need to be more protected. So we have collectively seen a sort of people power, people agency, being involved as part of the solution. We can't do it without this people agency. And that's the first lesson, a very, very important lesson. And then look at what's happening. The community spirit that we're seeing, led by women leaders in their communities, showing a neighborliness, showing a capacity to respond. Look at the coalitions that we're seeing for innovation, coalitions between scientists, business people, medical experts, governments, everybody turning from, making motor cars to making ventilators. All of this, that's the innovation we're going to need in the future for the other crisis, which is just as serious. And I think also we're somehow more human in our empathy. What I used to find talking about climate justice, and I would talk about small island states and the least developed countries and indigenous communities, and we'll hear Hindu speaking for the indigenous wisdom and the way to address climate change by listening to the indigenous. But somehow people felt, this isn't me. And it didn't touch the heart. Now it's me and you and all of us. And we're all very worried about now, very worried about the next few weeks, the next few months, the future. And it's created that empathy, that sense of purpose. I hope that, one thing we could do is to say that 2019 should be the peak year for the global emissions that are hurting our world. Scientists have been saying over and over again that we have to reduce global emissions by 45% in the next 10 years. That's not long for a huge change. We're seeing huge change. This is very hopeful. I'm actually more hopeful than I was last January, that we're going to actually be able to learn these lessons and work through them. And it's women and girls and women leaders and young people who are going to guide us and who are going to insist we do it differently, because we were not living sustainably. We have to have a green, resilient, equitable future, and it's going to take all of us.
Thank you, Mary. And among the people that it must take and whose voices we must hear, you have referenced, and those are the women from the indigenous communities. They come to this crisis with a deep generation of experience of living much more in harmony with the environment. Hindu Abaru Ibrahim is joining us now. She's the UN leader for the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate. And she joins us this morning from her native Chad, where we are hoping the Wi-Fi connection will be sustained for her presentation. Hindu, you've been such a powerful voice for so many of the Indigenous communities who have not been at those negotiating tables on climate agreements, and yet whose communities are always the most adversely affected by the COVID crisis, the climate crisis. Please share with us what you're witnessing now in Chad and other communities and the impact of the behavior changes that Mary referenced as you're witnessing them in your community.
Thank you very much, Pat, and I hope that you are all hearing me. Because of this internet, as you said, it's really not working well. So, as coming from Indigenous community and actually now in Chad, I think we witness climate change every day. But let me start by the positive way. We do live in harmony with the nature, and that's why we developed a lot of knowledge on it. And one of the examples I can share with you, like my grandmom, who never know what is school actually, and who never know how the big town look like or what is the electricity look, she know how to live in harmony with her earth where she is living. So she can just tell you by observing her cattle that's lying down, if they're facing the south and if they do not put them head down to the floors. So she know that in the next coming week, we have to move from this place to go to another one because rainy season is coming. So she don't need to see cloud in the sky. She just need to see the behavior of her own animals. So that's how the indigenous peoples are living in harmony with the nature. That's those who are living in the forest where there is the most biodiversity known around the world, better than a national park, where they can know all the species and keep them in balance. And it is the same like my brothers and sisters in Arctic. They know the nature, they know in the glaciers where they can avoid the sickness that can stay and start into the ice, because them rangers can tell them immediately they can grease in this area. So all those knowledge for us, when the climate is impacted, it is our life and livelihood is impacted. That's why we are frontline on the climate change. And if the world do not take the emission down, they do not listen to the scientists, they do not listen to our wisdom, I think world is not going in the right direction. That's why putting the indigenous people's knowledge and the science knowledge together, that's the way we can fasten the climate solutions. I'm actually in Chad, and we already in this month, starting April, we are more than 45 degrees. right now where I'm talking. I start my presentation in my computer and my computer shut down, and just the signal I have, like it's very hot, like twing, twing, it's hot. So I have to shut it down. So imagine how the technology can be adapted to the wave who can be very heat, and who can be adapted to the down cold to -50. So we have to look at the extreme and learn from the indigenous peoples, and we can adapt the technology to help us to those solutions. Because technology can work, but they can work only within exact time and within exact weather. So that's also the place of women and girls. That's how we know to do that. Because this detail of the weather change from 1 hour to another one, women know that. And let me tell you how we know that. We know that just from the shadow that we can look at from us. When you stand in the sun and you look at your shadow yourself, if it's coming both, or if it's coming only one, or if you can see your shadow in your back or in your front. So that can tell you exactly this time is going to be very hot in the day. So your phone cannot tell you the exact, but your own shadow in the sun position can tell you that. So how we can use this one? And those knowledge is only the women who know that, because they have to go out to find water. They have to go out to find them on food in the brood. So they know at what time it will be very hot for them, at what time it will be very down. So that's why we can contribute into the world fight. As we are contributing in the climate change, we can contribute the same time to all the sicknesses that coming. I'm going to end part by telling you, indigenous people won the war. The climate impact is impacting biodiversity. And when we harm our biodiversity, we harm the way that we are living, of course, we have to pay the consequence in our life. So that's why our health system need also to get adapt. So if all those environments are getting harmed, they change them gen, and they can create more than coronavirus if we do not tackle the climate change and biodiversity. So that's why we need to learn from indigenous peoples. We need to learn from the detailed knowledge that women and girls that own, and put them with the science. We can build a very sustainable and resilient society. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindu, for sharing all of that wisdom, knowledge, and experiences from the Indigenous community of Chad and all the others that you are representing as a new and powerful voice on the global stage. And I want to come back to you, and hopefully the Wi-Fi in Chad and the heat will allow us to do so, to talk more about this global empathy that Mary referenced, and whether or not this empathy we're feeling for each other in this virus crisis, that this will be empathy we also translate to feeling the global climate impact on communities everywhere. So thank you very much for joining us. It wasn't that long ago, we all remember that a teenage girl started a weekly protest outside the government buildings in our home country of Sweden, and many credit Greta with being among the first to hold truly government accountable for what she described as stealing the future from herself and all of the world's young people. And her protest launched a movement of young people, many of whom took up her climate strikes, and some, like our next panelist, became a leader in the United States. Chie Batista is from an indigenous community in her native Mexico, and at 16, quickly became a powerful voice and a leader among the youth climate activists who, along with hundreds of thousands of other young people all over the world, were demanding action and not more words. But Chie, we welcome you this morning for your words on what the impact has been of COVID-19 and the actions, the way that it has impacted your own climate advocacy and activism, and what pathways you see forward to using these learnings for your actions.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone, for being here. As Pat mentioned, I come from an indigenous community in Mexico, so I couldn't agree more with Hindu. I think indigenous knowledge is the basis for how to connect with climate justice advocacy, because indigenous people say we take care of the earth because the earth takes care of us. It's reciprocity, it's community, it's balance. With that said, we also need to treat every crisis like it deserves to be treated. I think that every crisis presents us with an opportunity to grow. And with the coronavirus pandemic, we are seeing that it is, a crisis that has ultimately taught us how to have solidarity with our community, really taught us how our individual actions impact not only our local community, but our global community. And we've learned so much as youth climate activists. First of all, the world has proven to us that it can come together to act for a crisis. Now there is no excuse, because we know that government can come together. We know that civil society can come together. We know that all these different sectors can come together to say this crisis deserves to be treated as one, and we all need to do our part in order to address it. And that is what we want to see as youth and as all climate advocates as a response to the climate crisis. Because we know that it's so intersectional that everybody can have a part in it. Everybody can be a climate activist because it's just acting on an issue that you care about, and it ultimately does affect all of us. So of course, because of the coronavirus pandemic, as it rapidly spread across the world, we had to suspend our climate strikes in person. So we have not been striking outside for about a month now, and our next global climate strike, which was going to be on April 22nd and 24th in some countries, is obviously going to have to be postponed. But this only presented us with a great challenge of how do we stay connected in our activism community? How do we actually keep going forward? Because the climate crisis is not ending just because we are on pause. And it's all of the, systemic issues that are being exacerbated because of the coronavirus pandemic are the same things that are that we will be stressed when the climate crisis hits, like the healthcare system and all these other systems that are not strong enough to really, address and be able to be able to hold a community in a crisis. So in response to that, we started something called Climate Strike Online, in which we all, just take a sign or write it on our computers and say what we demand for different weeks. And our theme for this Friday, actually today, is people over profit, which means in all of these times in which we are, trying to take care of people, not only because of the coronavirus pandemic, but also referring to the climate crisis. We need to take care of people over the companies and the endowments and all these interests that, as I'm sure all of you know, are very present in the world. So I am going to talk more about what specifically we have done in the next round of questions, but I just want to say that every crisis presents us with an opportunity, and the opportunity of this crisis is learn how to have solidarity. So thank you so much, Pat, for giving me the mic, and I look forward to all your questions.
Xie, I think the gratitude goes to you and to all the young people around the world who really raised the urgency of the climate threat and reminded us all that our voices matter, that there is something we can do. And I'm really interested in hearing more about how the strategies of the climate activists have changed now because of the learnings from COVID-19. So many of you remember, and I hope you read a textbook, I considered it a textbook for dealing with the climate crisis, a book published a few years ago called Drawdown. It explicitly laid out actions that we could take to reduce our own drawdown, in other words, our actions to reduce greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, which are essential to resolving the climate emergency. Its chief researcher and writer is with us today, Dr. Katharine Wilkinson, who, by the way, gave a brilliant TED Talk on this subject at TED Women in 2018. She put forth the idea then, widely endorsed now, of this critical link between the well-being of women and girls in terms of education, economic opportunity, and full equality, and the just solutions to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Wilkinson.
Thank you so much, Pat. This feels sort of wonderfully full circle because you and I met at Scole back in 2018. And there was a panel then about girls and women and climate. So delighted to be with all of you. I'm just going to do a quick screen share. Great. Is everyone seeing the cover of the Drawdown review?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yep. So as Pat said, Project Drawdown released the first body of our work in 2017, almost exactly 3 years ago. And just as this COVID-19 crisis was beginning to take hold of the world, we released this first major update to our work in the Drawdown review, which is freely available digitally. You can find it on our website at drawdown.org. And it's a sort of wonderful update, obviously, of our analysis of climate solutions, but also, I think, a really helpful distillation for those of you who know the original Drawdown book. In many ways, it was about every individual tree in the forest. And I think this is a really nice exploration of not just the trees, but the groves and how they relate to one another. So should be a really helpful resource for all of those thinking about climate solutions. And I think it's particularly useful in this moment as we think about the rebuilding of the global economy that will be happening because of the COVID recession and the major movement of capital. We have a huge opportunity to lean into climate solutions as part of that stimulus going forward, and what a green stimulus might look at. So this may be a helpful resource for folks. When we say the word drawdown, we're referring to a future point in time when the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases actually stops climbing and begins to steadily year over year decline. It really is probably the critical turning point for life on Earth, and we need to get there as quickly and safely and equitably as possible. And Project Drawdown really came to life to answer the question, can we get to drawdown with the solutions that are already in hand? Can we get there by mid-century? And if so, how do we do that? It's helpful just to ground ourselves quickly in the contours of the challenge. What you see here are the 6 major sectors of emissions that are creating the global warming that is sparking the climate crisis. Electricity production is a quarter, food, agriculture, and land use, also almost a quarter, industry, transportation, buildings, and then that sort of interesting 10% other energy-related emissions. Those are emissions related to extraction, refining, transmission of fossil fuels before they actually get burned in a power plant or a vehicle or some such. But the other part that hasn't, I think, gotten enough attention over the last decades are the things that nature is doing to help us. Almost 60% of the greenhouse gases we emit stay in the atmosphere, but land and oceans are doing a lot of work to actually rebalance and bring some of that carbon back home. So when we think about getting to drawdown, we have to think about both sides of this equation. So we have sort of a relatively simple framework that's helpful for understanding the full mosaic of solutions. The first is the most important. We have to reduce sources across all of those sectors of the economy, ultimately bringing emissions to zero. But even getting to zero emissions is not enough. We also have to think about how we support sinks and uplift the carbon cycle that Earth has so brilliantly evolved over 3.8 billion years. And then we also have to think about how we make some fundamental improvements to society, fostering equality for all. Most climate solutions have co-benefits to resilience, to health, but there are other areas, and Pat mentioned some of these, where actually the focus is on fundamental human rights, whether that's land rights, land tenure, access to education, that also have positive ripple effects for the climate. So this is just a kind of brief distillation of our results. So if we think about that first area of reducing sources, you won't be surprised to see that electricity has a major role to play, particularly in shifting electricity production to renewables, but also enhancing efficiency. There's a big role to play in the in what we produce, how we produce it in terms of food, and really huge opportunities around reducing food waste and moving towards plant-rich diets, particularly in high-income parts of the world where meat and dairy are overconsumed and not produced in sustainable ways. Protecting ecosystems, also a critical piece. And then you'll see a number of important solution areas in industry, transport, buildings. Again, lots of shifting from where we are now in terms of mobility, in terms of fuels for our buildings, and shifting to better alternatives, but also enhancing efficiency. And then if we look at the sink side of the equation, again, huge opportunities in agriculture, the shift to regenerative farming practices that, again, oftentimes are not about newfangled innovation. It's actually about returning to methods of production that have worked for society for decades, centuries, and even millennia. This, of course, also is about protecting and restoring ecosystems, particularly temperate and tropical forests, and also making use of degraded land in sustainable ways that actually help land come back into balance in its carbon cycle. Soil and photosynthesis are major players that have not gotten enough attention. We've done limited research to date around coastal and ocean sinks, and also engineered sinks like biochar, but those are included here. And then, of course, improved society. There is particularly an important role for securing the fundamental right to access to high quality education and to high quality voluntary reproductive health care for all women and girls, but also boys and men around the world. So this is just, how does all of this translate into future trajectories of temperature change? And what you see, the baseline sort of continuing upward curve is where things stand now, that we need to divert from that path towards something much better. And within Drawdown, within this body of work, we ran two different scenarios. One that you could consider very ambitious, and one that you could consider very, very, very ambitious. Again, this is just with solutions already in hand, proven, working already today. And you can see that in the first scenario, that puts us roughly on track for a 2°C temperature rise by the end of the century. And scenario 2 actually keeps us roughly in line with a 1.5-degree trajectory, which is the higher ambition of the Paris Agreement, and very much where we need to be going. So there's some important kind of takeaway in this, which is that we actually can avoid catastrophic warming just using climate solutions that are already in hand today. But doing that is going to require immense ambition and bold action. That's the only way that we can bring physical possibility and economic possibility into alignment with political and social possibility. So that's really the work at hand. And am I back out of share?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. And I just, if I can, want to throw in a poem for good measure. This is a poem by Alice Walker that makes me think of you, Pat, and you, Mary, and the kind of spirit that we need for that ambition today. It's called Calling All Grandmothers. We have to live differently, or we will die in the same old ways. Therefore, I call on all grandmothers everywhere on the planet to rise and take your place in the leadership of the world. Come out of the kitchen, out of the fields, out of the beauty parlors, out of the television. Step forward and assume the role for which you were created, to lead humanity to health, happiness, and sanity. I call on all the grandmothers of Earth and every person who possesses the grandmother spirit of respect for life and protection of the young to rise and lead. The life of our species depends on it. And I call on all men of Earth to gracefully and gratefully stand aside and let us do so.
Right on.
Mary remembers that we declared ourselves angry grannies a long time
That's right.
ago, right? But I want to thank you too for reminding us again, the wisdom of Indigenous communities come often from the grandmothers. There's a circle of grandmothers among the Native American Indian tribes, and they prophesied in many of their prophecies exactly where we are today. And that exists that in many Indigenous cultures. I can see Shie shaking her head, and probably Hindu too. And I heard it from my grandmother. And it's also part of why the intersectionality of generations is so evident today in looking at the screen and in looking at the comments coming in from participants everywhere. But also, Katharine, what Drawdown made so very clear, two things in my opinion. One is that there is an intersectionality of absolutely everything we do, from farming to delivering the food, to eating the food, to preparing the food, to every other part of our lives. But it also made it absolutely clear that there are individual actions we can take. And that's the narrative that has been missing in a lot of the climate conversations. And it's part of the frustration we all feel when we see behavioral change responding to the COVID-19 crisis. How do we translate that same radical information, transformational change, to everyone? And that starts with storytelling. So our final guest today is going to talk about that need to make sure our communications are clear, and that the narrative for the need for climate actions to be strengthened, especially at this time, is so critical. She's actually spent her whole professional life believing in this, right? That stories matter, that stories that tell the right kinds of stories well compel social change. Meg Assoud is an impact executive at Environmental or Exposure Labs. It's a company devoted to environmental storytelling. You may remember two great documentary films, Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral. They're just examples of what Exposure Labs and talented team have put on the screen and have led to, through their strategies, changes in behavior. So Mega, what are you thinking about the overarching narrative you're hearing more about today of women and girls, one you've been working on for some time with the Climate Lab and Doc Society? Where are the just solutions, and how do we communicate this part of the narrative better?
Yeah, thank you, Pat. It's such an honor to be in conversation with leaders that I turn to when I'm in seek of inspiration. And Katharine, thank you for that beautiful poem of just rooting us and reminding in the power of narrative. Because we are going to be talking about storytelling, I do have a couple of visuals that I'm going to be sharing too. Let me just get into that mode really quickly. Are we good with my screen? Wonderful.
Yeah.
So at Exposure Labs, we really believe in the power of storytelling to reach new audiences and inspire climate action. And the reason why we so vehemently believe in the role of storytelling, especially during this time of the climate emergency and a global pandemic, is because the public's response to these crises is informed by how the challenge is framed. Storytelling is how we create shared meaning. And while we may not be gathering right now in movie nights and parks, we're definitely consuming a lot of content. We're consuming public information campaigns, the nightly news, Netflix binging, and social media. And so what happens when we leave out women and girls and just solutions out of the narrative? Culture is the dimension where the battle for the relative importance of climate change compared to all the other priorities has to be fought and won. And as storytellers, we've really struggled to keep climate change at the forefront. So we were actually in conversation with our good friends and mentors, Jess Search and Beatty Finzi of the Doc Society, just talking about the problem with the current mainstream climate narratives. Mm-hmm. As we started to review some of the biggest climate films of the last decade, some that we've been involved with and some of our peers have also been involved with, we quickly saw a pattern. An amplification of trusted messengers that are primarily white men from the global north. Many of these films fall into a typical emotional journey of fear, 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 and then a little hope at the end, or it's just fear and apocalyptic fear, more of that. A lot of the language that's used is hyper-masculine, technocratic, and jargon films. As climate essayist Mary Hegler so beautifully articulated, science proves the crime, but you can't build a movement on it. No one's gonna go march for facts. That's just not a thing. We have to move beyond the monoculture of past climate narratives. One of our peers very beautifully expressed that what we really need is a biodiversity of stories as diverse as the ecosystem we seek to save. So together, Exposure Labs and Doc Society partnered to launch the Climate Story Lab. It's an initiative that brings together storytellers across all mediums, documentaries, podcasts, magazines, poetry series, and we put them side by side with scientists and political strategists, faith leaders and cultural curators, journalists and campaign organizers to really workshop how narratives can reach new audiences and mobilize communities. Core to the values of the Climate Story Lab is that climate justice has to be at the heart of our storytelling. We know that women, youth, and people of color are on the front lines of the climate emergency, and as Hindu beautifully illustrated, they have so much knowledge of generations, but rarely are they at the forefront of climate storytelling. We cannot address the climate crises by telling stories that deepen existing inequalities and injustices. So at the Climate Story Lab, it's an effort for our community of storytellers and practitioners to critically really start to ask ourselves, who is telling the story? How are we telling the story? Who is funding this? And how is this story actually getting shared? So we hosted our first Climate Story Lab in the US and the UK over this past year. And now we're actually in the process of creating a digital toolkit that can be shared with cultural organizers across the globe who are interested in hosting their own virtual gathering, addressing these topics. And it's interesting, we were actually in the process of running the Climate Story Lab in the UK just as the spread of COVID-19 was starting to really escalate. It was a really profound moment to be in a room with storytellers and practitioners who have dedicated their entire lives to addressing the climate emergency as a global pandemic was unfolding. Before the pandemic, we were starting to really understand the emotional blocks to why people's participation in climate action may have been hindered. There seems to be this growing tension between needing community, but also feeling really isolated. We know that addressing the climate crisis requires us to be connected and acting collectively. But however, even before the pandemic, many people already felt really isolated with their beliefs. Many didn't see themselves as part of the climate movement, me included. And misinformation has led to more divisiveness and polarization within our own communal networks. And so this pandemic has actually brought this tension to the forefront and challenged it. So while we are literally isolated, as we're all zooming in today, we are working really hard to create community and reach out to one another. Those family members who we may have stopped talking to due to political differences, we're now jumping on FaceTime to check in. As Mary had alluded earlier in the conversation, there's more human to this empathy. And also the reality of our survival is at stake is starting, I think, to settle in more. So this is the moment of narrative to really frame the way we're going to respond to this challenge. Artists need to tell stories that bring us back together and affirm our ability to act collectively for the common good. We know that we cannot fall onto past tropes of stories that just cause more concern and lead to engagement paralysis. We know that we can't tell stories that amplify oversimplified solutions that just leave out the most marginalized voices once again. We're about to embark on a massive rebuild of society, as Shihei had alluded to. Everything that we were told before the pandemic that wasn't possible no longer stands true. And so now we have permission to dream bigger, and we have to. We as storytellers can create a future narrative that shows the power of community working together, a narrative that gives us the courage to embrace the unknowns that lay ahead. And the place where I'm really finding my courage is because I'm starting to see that these stories already exist.
Mega, I want to start writing or filming or talking or inviting somebody I don't agree with to lunch. That was such a comprehensive look at why it matters. It matters the stories we're telling to each other, and it matters especially when so much is at stake. And we have seen with COVID-19 how hard it is for truth, even in that kind of crisis, to surface, how hard it is for the marginalized and most vulnerable voices to be heard. And here we are, still talking about the climate crisis facing all those same challenges. Your comment about grannies and earlier Hindu's comment about grannies led several grannies to chime in on chat, Mary.
Good.
You'll be pleased to know that there are several angry grannies. I'm referring to Dr. Agnes Wahoo being one of them, who just chimed in and said, you know, grannies in every culture bring such great wisdom to the forefront, and they do. And the questions have been so active. I think I'm going to stop and ask our facilitator and partner in this forum, Jessica, why don't we take one question and then we'll go back to the panelists for a second round of observations.
Great, thank you. And lots of the questions have been sort of along some of the same themes, so I'm going to combine a couple here. The first is from Manaz, who asks, the tragedy of COVID-19 has had a positive side, which is control of some of the activities that have been contributing to harming the climate. Are these factors being measured? And can you tell us how to use those habits to sustain them in the post-pandemic period? So that is part one. And then Karen Ryan asks a similar question, which continues with, can we mobilize industry and government quickly now to shift to green jobs?
Excellent. And I'm going to go to Katharine for the first part of the question, the question about what are we measuring? What are we seeing? We're all seeing bluer skies, and we think we're smelling better air when we're allowed to go outside and smell it. But what is being measured? What did we know? What did we learn so far about the changes in behavior and climate?
Thanks, Pat, and thanks for the question. So Dr. Kate Marvel is a climate scientist at NASA and Columbia, who I turn to regularly for, you know, kind of the best word on where the science of monitoring our atmosphere is, because that's not how I spend most of my days. NASA is measuring the impact on emissions of this time of pandemic. Jury is still out, according to Kate. The the sort of early data looks like we're seeing a very significant impact on particulate matter, but probably not a particularly significant or sustained impact on emissions.
You need to explain, Katharine, you need to explain particulate matter. It doesn't roll off the tongue.
Do you want to take that one, Mary?
It's just air quality, basically.
Thank you, Mary. Yes.
Yeah, so there's less, essentially less particles coming out of tailpipes and other things. So that's the air quality improvement. But if you think back to that sort of rainbow chart that I showed, transport is 14% of global emissions, and a lot of transport is still continuing. Passenger transport is down, air travel is down, but most of the other sectors of emissions in the economy are clipping along, right? We're still generating electricity with coal and oil and natural gas. We're continuing to manufacture steel and cement, on and on and on. So I think, there's certainly an opening here for addressing some of those areas of passenger emissions, and certainly telepresence is one of the solutions we look at within Drawdown, and so there's definitely some opportunity there to sustain.
Yeah. Thank you, Katharine. Mary, can I come to you for the second part of that question, which was the action, it needs the cooperation and, in fact, the leadership from industry and government, and can we expect that linkage to be made from this crisis to the climate crisis?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the jury's out. What we are seeing is these incredible coalitions now to provide the solutions to COVID-19, whether it's ventilators, whether it's masks, whether it's support for workers to stay and businesses to be able to come back into recovery in the future, et cetera, et cetera. But what we need is actually to take the opportunity, which Shia was rightly talking about, and make sure that the recovery which has to come will be green, resilient, equitable, with just transition. Just transition meaning that those who worked in coal, oil and gas are not just dumped, that they also are part of a way forward that is going rapidly towards green, but they also have a future, whether it's being pensioned off, training, skills, etc., more industry into their communities, which is green and resilient and equitable. There is a lot of talk in the European Union, for example, about centering around the European Commission's proposal for a European Green Deal, which is very active now. China is the first country to recover because it's dealt with the crisis more effectively, though it's still monitoring it closely. And unfortunately, it looks as if it's going back to the bad old ways of coal, increasing, in fact, its coal to power itself up again. If China and Korea, and if they go that route, it will damage that opportunity, that recovery. So I think we all need to now use our voices and our efforts to say, look, we've seen what can be done and has to be done when we have a real crisis. This is a real crisis. And I think, Katharine, somehow the scientists have to make the curves for climate as present in everybody's brain as we now have the curves for COVID. We all know about the high lump and how we have to extend it away. We have to do the same with the climate and feel it and empathize. And grannies have to make it part of the conversation around every table, because we cannot afford to go back to business as usual the wrong way. We have to take this opportunity.
And the good news that we're hearing and seeing in this panel is that at each end of the age spectrum, from grannies to the very young girls, which is a perspective that my good friend and convener of Women Around the World, Jude Kelly, who founded Women of the World, just reminded me in a chat, it's the solidarity we're looking for between all of our generations and the wisdom of all of our generations from all of our communities. And we are hearing that in today's conversation. So I'm deeply grateful for the different perspectives. Shia, that leads me back to a question for you that I think is on the minds of many. And you referenced it in your first comments about the strategies that the climate strikers was to go out, be together, show massive numbers, and therefore hopefully inspire action. Well, you can't do that. You can't come together in those ways. So what is happening now with the youth movement?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, in reference to the grandmothers, I just want to point out that, you know, in Indigenous communities, there's youth and elder circles all the time in which the youth learn from the elders, and we learn to be respectful, to work together. And I think that linkage between youth and, you know, wisdom is missing in a lot of our conversations, which is why I'm so grateful that you chose to make this panel intergenerational. And that is kind of our foundation for this new initiative that we just started called We the Planet. So it's not we the people, it's we the planet, because it is about all of us coming together. And one of the most important things about that initiative is that we want to get the voices of youth into the media, because that's all we're seeing right now. And we want to do it, like Mega so beautifully articulated, through storytelling, through telling our stories, because we can only change the narrative when we change the stories that we tell. And when we change the narrative, we change the culture. So if the narrative is, if the storytelling is, you know, this is how I was affected because of the climate crisis, then you need to implement climate justice into everything you do. Then the narrative becomes, how do we not only address the future of youth, but also the present of so many vulnerable communities? And when you change that, then the culture becomes, I'm not a climate activist on Fridays when I strike, but I'm a climate activist every day because of the decisions I make every day. So We the Planet is kind of a campaign. It's not really an organization, but it's a campaign that—
It's 1 o'clock.
Oh, sorry, my computer. It's a campaign that aims to bring together you know, all the different youth movements that are happening across the world. We are in partnership with Fridays for Future and Fridays for Future Digital, but it's more catered towards media presence because we're writing op-eds, and we are reaching out to a lot of influencers and different politicians so that they can say this Earth Day, and we are doing it like through a picture or video that you can say, this Earth Day, I commit to an individual action and a systemic action, because both are indisputably necessary to tackle the climate crisis. We cannot recycle our way out of the climate crisis, but if we only strike and don't change our behavior, that's not gonna have an impact either. So we need to merge both, and we need to really know how our actions, systemic and individual, impact the world. So you're all welcome to join. You can check us out on like all the social media platforms at We the Planet, and I would love to answer any of your questions afterwards if you have any.
Yes,
and Shia, the elders are already involved with young people with this We the Planet. Yeah, it's great.
Very true. The elders and the young people coming together, and that's how we all learn and move forward. And moving forward from this recorded version of the forum you're hearing today live, there will be records of it on the Skull Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation websites, but also all the resources that are being referenced, like the We the People referenced, Katharine's references, Mary's, they'll all be made available as a part of this forum. So thank you all and just be sure that all of our participants, and thank you again to all the participants for such an active conversation going on. I want to continue, given that we're moving in to our last half hour, to go back to Hindu, who gratefully we still have and are seeing, and talk more again about most of the narratives, most of the action-oriented regulations, agreements, they seem to still be favoring the global north and adversely affecting the global south. And so what actions now are you seeing based on this new solidarity being felt and built around the world that we can take that supports the needs, the urgent needs of Indigenous communities?
Thank you very much again, Pat, and I hope that you heard me well again. So I really enjoy all the thoughts from what you said. And taking the perspective of the global north and global south suddenly is continuing in this COVID crisis too. So this division and this is likely to share all the knowledges and all the resources at the same time is still happening. So when like in our community or in Africa in general, we saw that US immediately the COVID, they immediately put in the tables more than 3,000 billion for the economy. And I said like, wow, how in less than 1 month, all the rich countries come with the behavior of we need to increase the economy and inject that in all our factory. I'm like, how about climate? We like begging you to put a little money in Green Climate Fund to fund the adaptation of our communities, to fund the mitigation of our communities. But we never saw the colors. We have the protests. We have to go to the street. We have to show you. It's still to today, my community drinking the not clean water. So if the world can raise all this solidarity around economy, around all the health system in less than a month, why they cannot do that for the climate? It's not have to be to come very quickly as COVID and impact everyone's life and kill them before we come in solidarity. I think climate change is killing more. So that's why the COVID crisis is hitting hard the poorest and the most vulnerable. And those are the indigenous peoples who are often left behind on all the health system. And particularly, I'm worried about my community and about all the indigenous communities who don't have the access to the liveable health system. And also, to win this fight, we have to put it in the same time with the climate and biodiversity. So we need to act in unity, being one people on the one planet. I love what Jersey said, we the planet, because we are only one species of this nature. We are not the master of the nature. That's the thing we have to understand. And when we will recover from this crisis, hopefully we will need to build a better and more equitable world where all our ecosystem can be protected and who can protect our health. So we have the tools because we have the SDGs, who are the 17 goals, who include all our health, education, culture, all economy, all the systems. So why we cannot use them? We have 10 years to do it. And we have the Paris agreements. I think the best people who can implement it, as you said, is the Grammy. And our Grammy got the knowledge and they are passing to us. All indigenous communities do have that. So come learn to.
We may be losing her, but what an urgent call to action. It's hard to imagine that the world could turn away from such an urgent call that we are hearing actually from all of the participants today. And one of the things Hindu referenced, and it comes back to you, Megha, that we need media telling these stories. We need to have places we can go for truth and to inspire our actions. We've seen that happen now with COVID-19 to some degree.
I agree. So that's why, sorry to cut you, that's why we invite all the media to come to the indigenous communities and we can introduce them to our grandma, to our youth, and to learn from us, to understand and to share it.
Thank you for that invitation, and we should all be there just as soon as we can. We'll have to figure out ways to transport without CO2 emissions, but we'll work on that. Greta showed us one way, didn't she? But Megha, I'd like you to just comment briefly to a question that's come up in 2 or 3 of the questions on our chat bar. What media outlets or strategies do we suggest people turn to? I mean, where are we going to find the truth and the right actions that are called for? Any ideas and suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think what this panel so beautifully showcases is that we need to let women be the architects of this future narrative. we need to support women. And that doesn't mean just funding their stories, but supporting their vision and their entire process. For generations, women have been centering climate justice in their stories. They're not afraid of complex narratives that don't have this like happy ending at the end. They're really leading the charge on challenging extractive storytelling practices and showcasing what co-creation with your community actually looks like. So I believe that women are already telling the stories. Society just isn't listening.
Finding those stories too brings us to the question that I'm seeing referenced over and over again, and is always on our minds when you talk about what can we do, what actions can we take, is where is the axis of power? I mean, where is it still sitting? Because as Bruno references in his email, when you look at the way the current multiple $1 trillion economic stimulus packages are structured, beyond the part that's aimed directly at the public health emergencies, it could look like we're keeping afloat the carbon economy. And many people have referenced Canadians who have joined us about the pipeline going forward. Mary, I'd like you to comment on that if you would. Again, it's the will, isn't it? So that this power shift, and it is going to take a power paradigm shift, it seems, to move out of this carbon economy.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We've come a long way in a month. We have now a global recession. We have hundreds of thousands of people out of jobs, great fear about health, etc. But we're not still seeing enough connection made, as we've been making it, between the immediate COVID crisis and the almost immediate climate crisis, because we have 10 years to do an enormous amount. And we really have, so we have to use this opportunity. Again, you know, Shia, I couldn't agree with you more. It is the opportunity that we have to seize. We have to make sure that the money doesn't go into supporting fossil fuel and the oil price and that kind of thing. We must make sure that Asia doesn't recover on the back of coal as much as possible. And certainly the elders, we will do our very best, including trying to be in touch with some of the leaders to try to really say, we have seen in this crisis, because the economy has been dealt a severe blow, that we do care about people, we care about workers, we care that businesses can be maintained for the future, but we need to care more about the kind of recovery. It's got to be a green, resilient recovery that is a just transition from a future that would have been terrible. We were not on course for a safe world. We've got a shock now. Let's make the opportunity of being able to move in a way that recognizes that we have to have a different model of how our economy is run. People are talking about a basic income, but in particular, and I'm talking now to what Hindu is talking about as well, we have to recognize that just as in this COVID crisis, we have to do far more to address the needs of developing countries who are being hit already and will be hit more by the COVID crisis. So we have to ensure that developing countries can develop with clean energy, can leapfrog into the green recovery that is the way forward. And you know, the drawdown approach shows we can do this, but we have to do it not with the getting back to business as usual fossil fuel, but actually moving more rapidly to green, resilient, equitable, just transition.
I think we have to make you president of some country again, Mary, as fast as possible.
Well, I'm an angry granny, that'll do.
That we need to. Katharine, the reference again to drawdown and the fact that for many of us, it really did become a textbook of daily activity. I mean, you know, here's what we do, here's what it impacts. I mean, it just laid it out clearly. And you've now followed up with your approach and your linkage to write a new book, which is coming out in September, I think, called All We Can Save. And it is, to all the points we've heard today, an anthology of women climate writers, including Shia. We look forward to reading your essay, Shia. But that says so much in itself, that when you sat down to write a new book on climate and where we are and where we need to go, you went to women writers, women's voices. So tell us what we can expect and what can we save?
Thank you, Pat. I think to Mega's point that the stories are being told, the leadership is there, the ideas are there, it's the amplification and the listening that is the challenge. And my co-editor on this book, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, and I really wrote the proposal for it in a fit of frustration one weekend about how much of the sense making about this moment is still being done by a relatively small cabal of white men. Mega showed us some of how that manifests in film, but it's true in media, it's true on social media, it's true on panels and keynotes and everywhere you turn. And I think it's worth just remembering that maybe most of all, the climate crisis is a leadership crisis. And that is why we really wanted to lift up this group of, we have 39 essayists from all over the US and also 16 poets. And I'll just read a couple of paragraphs that we wrote this week, because I think it speaks to the opening that we have right now to reorient values and approaches. And it turns out that a health crisis is creating that opening, but it is the same core system that needs our attention. So what we do now is dream. From a foundation of science and community, we must imagine the future we want to live in and the future we want to pass on, and every day do something to reel the dream closer to reality. The work is hard and uncertain, yet we find our warrior spirits charge ahead and care for each other every step of the way. We will stumble as we chart this unmapped path. Let's forgive our fallibility, safeguard our empathy, and lead with kindness as we go. In the poignant words of Adrienne Rich, there must be those among whom we can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors. And if there's one theme that runs through the beautiful writings in this book, it really is a ferocious love for one another, for the earth, for all beings, for justice, for a life-giving future. And I think moving forward in that spirit of ferocious love, not conquest, humility, not righteousness, and a generous curiosity, not hardened assumptions, is so important. And I think that is actually something that climate leaders know what it's like to live and work with broken, open hearts all the time. And so I think, you know, we have a moment to lead also on the kind of inner experience, the emotional and psychological experience that others are now going through, feeling sort of a world at threat across every place and every dimension. So.
Thank you, Katharine. Thank you for sharing those words. I can't wait to read the entire book. Thank you for your work. And boy, are we online today with a lot of climate warriors on screen, and those of you who are contributing so greatly behind the scenes. Well, let's try and take a couple of more questions from our participants, at least maybe one more. Jessica?
Thank you. Yes, so Irene pointed out that many governments are run by men, and in this moment we are seeing perhaps some sacrificing human life in pursuit of economic growth, which we've seen before when it comes to sacrificing the environment for economic growth over time. So how do we seize this moment to really elevate women's leadership?
Mary, I'll come back to you. You have elevated the voices of women behind the scenes and in front.
Yeah.
Answer that, please.
Yeah, I think actually we're going to see leaders actually exposed if they're not dealing properly with COVID-19, because it's going to be there in the broken health system, the failure. And, you know, I think, unfortunately, in the United States, we're going to see that a lack of early preparedness is going to mean more people are going to die in quite significant numbers in the richest country in the world, that's a very sad kind of feature. And we don't want to politicize this talk, but leadership does matter. You know, you can see leadership in some of the European countries where you have women prime ministers, women presidents, and it is making a big difference. You can see Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand giving good leadership. It does matter. But I just want to come back for a moment, because I so loved what Katharine said, ferocious love. It's amazing how little we talk about love. And yet we love our families, we love our friends, we have a great capacity for empathy, compassion, and love. But somehow we crowd it out. And I think women now have to somehow take this moment and surround it with, we're supposed to socially distance, it's hurting us. We're social animals, we're social beings. That's in our DNA. We want to embrace and to love. And I think this is one of the ways in which we will try. Now, the Hindu mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, and they were an extraordinary agenda which was agreed in September 2015 by 193 countries. So it is a global agreed agenda. And it says we should leave no one behind. We should even prioritize the furthest behind first. Gender equality is goal 5. Goal 10 is equality between countries and within countries. You know, there's a huge package of what we could bring forward. And the language introducing the 2030 agenda is the language of human rights, gender equality, fairness, etc., and leaving no one behind. So, you know, that's the agenda we can drive forward. We don't have to reinvent that wheel.
The inspiration that has come from each and every one of you today gives me hope that the lessons we are experiencing now, the changes in the human behavior, the radical empathy, actually, Mary, that many are feeling. Maybe that's the name of a new movie. Fierce love, fierce compassion, fierce empathy. And I appreciate the fact that you bring forward the need to increase the representation and as well as the agency of women in terms of being the storytellers, being the ones, Mega. And I know that you're doing that work. If you want a final word on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we are just navigating these crises together, it's just like not forgetting the power of storytelling to inspire action, right? There are so many incredible advocacy organizations that are out there that have been working in their communities for generations, but they're struggling to build the political will that's needed for the actions that they're trying to achieve. There's also so many incredible storytellers out there who have already created and captured amazing stories from their communities, but they're not being amplified. And so I think just trying to think more creatively about how do we bridge this gap between these storytellers and these advocacy organizations to be working collectively together, because I do believe when these two superpowers come together, we can build the political will for climate action that we're all in search of.
Thank you very much. Shea, any final words? I love someone said earlier we should change capitalism to we the people. Just take that. The power to the young people who are reclaiming democracies too everywhere, along with climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me that's such a big concept and something that like grounds me every day, just because I don't know if many of you know, but I am from Mexico, half Mexican, half Chilean. So I lived in Mexico till I was 13 years old. So that means I cannot vote in the US, but I'm still heavily involved in politics and leadership, like Mary was saying. And I still push leaders to do their work because that's their responsibility. Their responsibility is to work for the people and to work for our best interest. And our best interest is a healthy, livable planet and community, you know, all of those things. Mm-hmm. So I'm always reminded of the fact that democracy is not only voting on election day, but actually voting with what you consume, what you support, what you watch, what you put out to the world. Because even though I can't participate in the most conventional way, I am still part of this community and society. and I have a say, and you have a say every time you do something. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your warrior spirit, Shie. Mary, you once said, and in fact, it was one of the great inspirations. Oh, may I go to Hindu first, though, because we have her back. Well, we did momentarily, and perhaps will join us again. Mary, you talked about envision the world you want to see. Imagine it. Think about it. Rush towards it.
Yeah.
Final words on how we might do that.
Yeah, I think, everybody has to take both crises personally in their lives. We are taking the COVID crisis because we can't not. It has totally blown us apart. It's affecting lives, it's affecting health, it's affecting people, it's affecting the economy. It's sudden, it's on top of us. We have to take climate exactly as seriously as that. And then we have to do the things that are important to change, to moving to a green, resilient, fair, equitable, just transition to the future. But in order to get there, we have to kind of imagine it. And Christiana Figueres has a very good book out called The Future We Choose. And she makes it very clear. It's in our hands to choose that future. So, let me just kind of point at the things we can learn from COVID. We can learn that science matters. It's the health experts who are on our televisions every day now, and we're listening carefully because it matters. We have not listened to the scientists, but we should. Human behavior matters hugely. We, as people, are solving the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. It's our collective power that's doing it. It's every household that's, distancing, not shopping for irrelevant stuff because the shops are shut now, not going out, literally being part of a communal love effort because we want to protect people, we want to protect health workers, etc. Collaboration matters. What the scientists and the business and the governments are doing to completely turn around so that we can cope with this, we have to do that for climate. Developing countries have to be right front and center, both the COVID, how we are going to address their much worse problems with weaker systems. I actually know of a project in Ethiopia at the moment for an app for everybody in Ethiopia that they'll be able to monitor their health. So a kind of bottom-up app to monitor. Developing countries need that kind of support now, immediately, but they also need the technology for clean development, investment in clean development, and we should be cutting out the fossil fuel now and immediately. These are the lessons, and if we can do it with ferocious love, we can change everything.
I'm tempted to make that the final word. Mary always seems to have exactly the way to sum up all of that we have heard and felt in this time together. Hindu, I want to thank you for finding enough Wi-Fi to rejoin us, and how much you will be in our hearts in the days and months to come, you and the community of Chad, as you fight this COVID-19 crisis and you continue to fight for a global climate crisis to be resolved. So thanks to each of you for what you've done.
Just to say that, thank you to do not leave me behind, and thank you to do not leave someone just because of internet or because of technology that being hit out. So this is also the example of solidarity. Even it's coming back, we are doing it together. So this is a lesson learned for COVID, but lesson learned also for climate change, not because someone is not at the same level that you have to leave him. You have to empower everyone and each to be in the same level that can protect the people and protect the planet at the same time. Thanks so much, Pat.
Now that really is the bravo. But because I have a penchant for ending all forums with poems, I hope you'll indulge me in the voice of a Indigenous woman, Joy Harjo, a Native American who is the poet laureate of this country, actually. And she wrote a beautiful poem that's too long for me to share in its entirety, so I hope she will forgive me for picking up on part of it to close us out today. We were bumping into each other in the dark, and now we had no place to live since we didn't know how to live with each other. And then one of the stumbling ones took pity on another and shared a blanket. A spark of kindness made a light. The light made an opening in the darkness. Everyone worked together to make a ladder. A Wind Clan person climbed out first into the new world. And then the other clans, the children of those clans, their children and their children, all the way through time till now, and to this morning light to you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Pat.
The forum will be available on skol.org, on the Rockefeller Foundation website. Please share it widely on all your social media and platforms. Jessica, thank you and congratulations to the Skol Foundation for optimizing the value of this new codectivity and giving us an opportunity to have these conversations. Thanks to all who joined us.